Hi, my name is Nathan Stretch, and I'm the manager of community development at Kitchener Public Library, where I'm recording this talk. And I'm inside the beautiful and useful Zaire recording studio at Kitchener Public Library's Central Branch, an urban library in the downtown area. Kitchener is a mid-sized city, one of a tri-city region that includes Kitchener, Waterloo, and Cambridge. And we are a neighboring city to Toronto in Southern Ontario, Canada. Now, I believe that Dr. Willingham invited me to talk with you today because of my interest in the intersection between climate justice, public space, and community music. And for a little bit of background off the top, I do have my MA in community music from Laurier. And as I mentioned, I work here at Kitchener Public Library, where I'm the division manager of community development, a portfolio that includes fundraising, events, marketing, and studio projects, a strategic role with practical implications and duties attached. Previous to working at the library, I worked at a grassroots community building organization called the Working Center, also in Kitchener, where I worked closely with visionary and highly venerated founders Joe and Stephanie Mancini, who you may remember from the video resource that I sent out to help contextualize this talk, Emergence and the Emergency. And while I was at the Working Center, I worked very closely with highly marginalized individuals, and this was my main focus. And for the last number of years, I was helping to coordinate the entirety of the Working Center, and specifically working in our social housing projects, housing for highly complex individuals with wraparound supports, coordinated by 24-hour teams. And I was also operating a studio project out of the Working Center off of the side of my desk called Common Studio. Common Studio is an access to resource concept around filmmaking and digital design, where we were attempting to get into the hands of people tools for telling their stories or building skills, while eliminating some of the barriers to those tools, mainly expense, opportunity, industry gatekeeping, and sometimes expertise. And while I was at the Working Center, I also had the opportunity to work with Dr. Frances Westley, who's the main voice in the other resource that I sent through, Catastrophe and Resilience. We were working on a talk and doing a series of interviews at the Working Center around climate justice when the COVID-19 pandemic hit. We shifted quickly to talk a little bit more generally about crisis and a little bit more specifically about COVID-19. So we didn't get to delve into her work as it applied to a hyperlocal organization like the Working Center, its community building ethics, and its understanding of its place in a global ecological system. So I want to touch on a little bit of that today. And just to expand more on my point of view or bias, I'm really working under the influence of three major institutions when I think about this talk specifically. So we're going to talk a little bit about Laurier and community music. We'll talk a little bit about the Working Center, which is an anti-bureaucratic, highly radicalized, highly ethical, local response to poverty in Kitchener. And my most recent employment here at Kitchener Public Library, which is known as a very innovative and forward-thinking library that continues to expand on its core functionality. A lot of my current work here is about emergent direction and operating at the liminal edge of what a library can do, extending that warm welcome to engage the very diverse communities that populate Kitchener, especially in the downtown core. In my work with these institutions, I can identify meaningful overlap in values, philosophies, and principles, where we find a lot of commonalities. In my movement between these institutions within a shared community, I've looked for this kind of synthesis. How is this thing like that thing, and how can we work together to create something new and something meaningful, something responsive here in Kitchener-Waterloo? Community music, as imagined in the community music program at Laurier, has a set of values that are akin to a practical philosophy. And I'm inspired by the ethical imagination of scholars and practitioners who imagine community music as a vehicle for working at the boundaries, including working at the disrupted edge of institutionalized music education. Asking questions of ourselves in the community like, how do we work out in the community? How do we meet people where they're at? How do we work with people who've been rejected or excluded from music making? And how do we value those contributions in meaningful, sustainable ways? At the Working Center, we worked within a set of principles, and these principles at one point were organized by an artist into something called the Tree of Life. And the Working Center is a highly philosophical organization that is also highly practical. And the work at the Working Center is the marriage of these two things, thinking the big thoughts and committing the simple acts on the daily. And sometimes that reprieve on the daily, so you might end up responding to immediate crisis straight through the night as you commit to a series of simple acts, and then try to make sense of them through the lens of the philosophy or principled stance. A lot of the Working Center's philosophy comes from its roots as an organization responding to global crisis at a local level. In Working Center's case, economic downturn in the 80s, and this reconciliation or re-reconciliation of the individual in the group with meaningful work or community involvement. And some of the principles of the working center are work as gift, producerism, like valuing makers in the making of things, community tools, like creating access for people in real and meaningful ways so they can put their hands on the full tool. And this is a bit of response in some ways to the idea of an assembly line where you only assemble your piece or you only see a small portion of what intends to be a larger finished product. The working center venerates the volunteer, the giving and the receiving of meaningful work outside of traditional commerce. And there are myriad other pieces and philosophies that surround those ideas that are all based on inclusion and grassroots methodologies, as well as highly developed and continually responsive understanding of the earth as our shared home. How do we live here together with all of our complexities and our seemingly irreconcilable differences? What can we do together that has real local and global implications? At the library, we have a public document that's more of a strategic plan. And the strategic plan values ideas, but it also brings the community into its own responsibility. We talk about removing barriers to access. We talk about making things, so creating content or providing the tools for creating content or have meaningful access around skills development, and problem solving. And the library is even more of a bricks and mortar organization compared to the first two institutions. So when I think about the library in the community, I think about multiple community library locations in that web. And that network is really effective and really meaningful and also highly place-based. Of course, libraries expand out through alternative and electronic means to meet people where they are at, but the library itself has a real value as established and normative public space, as bricks and mortar buildings and facilities that can be easily and regularly accessed. One of the enduring and beautiful attributes of the library is its community positioning as one of the few public spaces that actively decentralizes commerce, where you can participate and you're not expected to spend anything. And your value as a participant is not predicated on your ability to spend money or withhold money. It's just not central to the economy. And libraries have established this over time and work to maintain this space. The Working Center also has many spaces that are highly accessible and are particularly successful at engaging with highly liminal individuals and groups in these places. Working Center refers to them as public hosted spaces, where there's free and low barrier access to tools and to service that are thoughtfully hosted by volunteers and staff, people who are there to meet you where you are at, to understand your unique set of circumstances, and then to partner with you in problem solving. For both the library and the Working Center, we're invested in moving beyond the passive welcome, beyond a passive access concept, where you just open the doors and step back and see what people do. There's a very intentional weaving and ensembling, a thoughtfulness and ethic and analysis that's really important, personal and organizational responsibility. Of course, community music is highly invested in this concept of hospitality as well, whether that's inviting someone into a space or a room where you might make music together, or the tension of inviting someone into music making, or inviting someone into what might be considered rarefied air, or only the venue for established or highly educated individuals. This idea that space, status, and assumption is disrupted by intentional activity, by the radicalized inclusivity of the community musician, who invites people in who have not been reconciled to the practice or to the medium, is a fruitful one. It leads me towards a deep analysis of reciprocity, an expansive concept that shows up in community music. It shows up in the library, and it also shows up in the work at the Working Center, which is really where this concept of reciprocity has been practiced for 40 years. Working Center's practice of reciprocity in the community is the work of Dr. Ken Westhughes, who was on the board of the Working Center as they were establishing themselves in the arc of their community building project. The traditional concept of reciprocity is this kind of tit for tat. I do something for you and you do something for me. But Ken's understanding of reciprocity is really about the meeting of individuals without preconceived notions, of opening up to the surprise of that collaboration. It's a little bit like this idea of being more than the sum of your parts, this idea that when two people or groups are able to meet and to open to one another without a lot of assumptions, that a third thing can happen, something that neither of the participants expected, and that this surprise has value. It relates to this idea of hospitality and hostility in the moment, because the surprise is the disruption of the status quo. And this concept of reciprocity is what allows for innovation and for meaning making, whether you're making music, whether you're running a program, whether you're an expert or brand new facilitator, whether you are constructing a building, or whether you are responding to crisis. And so in Kitchener, we're kind of coming out of the end, or I guess this is up for debate, of the COVID-19 pandemic. We've been kind of living inside of nesting pandemics for a while, an opioid crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic and the kind of long doom of and the expanding understanding of the climate crisis. Because of my work at the Working Center, which is really a kind of daily reminder that many people are disillusioned and disjointed and left out socially, I was privileged to be exposed to the multiple complexities that are influencing our broader social response to crisis, but also to continue to center the individual experience of people who are living heavily marginalized lives. So I want to talk a little bit about a major building project that we're undergoing here at the library that serves the general public, inclusive of liminal and equity-deserving groups. We're expanding on our network of libraries to include a brand new library branch. In fact, I came on board here while the library was already in the planning process and was immediately involved. Kitchener Public Library is always planning to build a really green library to complement the high standards set by the renovation of the central branch, but have expanded on our understanding of what a green library is and what a long-term sustainable building is to now be planning and building and fundraising for a net zero library. The Southwest Community Library will exist totally separate from the grid, except where it feeds excess energy back into it. Along with net zero, the new library is also a carbon zero building. Over time, it will make up any of the carbon that was released into the atmosphere due to the construction process. So a very clean, very inspirational, very meaningful build. This is not the first build that I've been a part of. It's not the first public, semi-public, meaningful, or community servicing build that I've been involved in. And it's not the first build that's been influenced by community music values. But this is the build that is most responsive to climate crisis. And in fact, when we're looking for funding, because it costs extra upfront to build a facility of this kind, we found that the federal government was accepting applications for new builds that would serve the community, but only if they were net zero. So we have this local national alignment and find ourselves aligning a reasonably modest public build in a mid-sized city with the kind of national and global aspirations of government entities that are committing to reduce carbon emissions over the next number of years. Now, Frances Westley has, in her research and the research of her peers, been thinking a lot about what it means to respond to a warming world and what a warmer world might look like. She and her colleagues had come up with what I think is a reasonable rendering of a future that declares we're not going to totally avoid the consequences of climate change. The Earth will warm. And as a result, some places that are currently inhabitable become uninhabitable, and some places that are less desirable to live will become more desirable to live. And in this case, she would suggest that Kitchener will become a more desirable place to live comparatively. And so she and her colleagues hypothesized that one of the significant impacts that a place like Kitchener will face, how it will be affected by climate change, really has to do with how do we receive impending climate refugees. So if the Earth is warming and some places become uninhabitable, some places become more desirable, it follows that people will move from the less inhabitable places to the more inhabitable places, including a place like Kitchener. So when the library is preparing this building, when we're thinking about it as a way that's going to meet the needs of an emergent community, because where we're building this in Kitchener is already underserviced by libraries and growing quickly, we're also thinking into the future about the ways that this public space will meet the needs of a community influenced by an impending influx of people and culture and trauma and loss because of a rapidly changing world, a rapidly warming world, a world where your traditional home may no longer be inhabitable due to climate change. One of the things I really appreciated about spending time with Dr. Westley was how she and her colleagues had come to the conclusion that their research demanded action of themselves. And some of the useful analysis that she and her colleagues did was to identify things they felt like they were entitled to, including this kind of fascinating triumvirate that people were entitled to look good, feel good, and move forward. And also to think about some actionable philosophies or concepts that we could put into play with ourselves, or that we could begin to practice in order to prepare for an influx of new people who are displaced by the climate emergency. And she and her colleagues came up with some useful concepts for self-reflection. She talked a little bit about these ideas in the resource I shared, and I'll bring them up again here. You may remember her talking about tuning, this idea that you would start to imagine what the other is like, to imagine what they've gone through, to prepare yourself for a different world that is affected by a community that has been displaced and that has now been placed adjacent to you. And this idea of tuning is a first step to reconciling yourself to this idea, and then going beyond the idea to reconciling with actual people. The second concept is all about disarming, the idea quite literally of laying down your arms or what you feel might be your right to protect the things that you have, including entitlements to look good, to feel good, and to keep moving forward. And the ethic of this concept is preparing for an eventuality, and an eventuality that includes people, that includes individuals, it includes displaced people, people with needs that you can understand, and people with needs that are different than the needs that you experience. And so the ethical and the moral concept here, again, is about preparing for a very human reality and making a choice to open, to welcome, to prepare for meaningful interaction without preconceived notion. Opening to surprise. Because the third concept, and in our conversation, we decided that there was enough similarity here that we would work within this idea of working center concept again, is that Frances Westley in her research and the research of her colleagues demands reciprocity from individuals, groups, and governments, in so much as we share the responsibility of preparing for an earth that warms and the displacement of people as a result, but also that we would put aside preconceived notions and open to something new, to the surprise or the beauty of the surprise, the responsiveness that comes from meeting people where they're at, even at a global or governmental scale. So this new reality is sustainable and hopeful, is robust, is inclusive, is meaningful, is human. So how does the community music piece mix back into all of this? Kitchener Public Library is building this new project in a hyperlocal yet global context. We're preparing for people to come to Kitchener as a result of climate change. We learned a lot during the COVID pandemic about making a building that's not only environmentally sustainable, but socially responsible. A building that is open to the outdoors, that is modular, so that it can be used by lots of different groups of people for lots of different purposes, for the things that we know might happen or are likely to happen, and things that will hit us by surprise. We've done a lot of community consultation. We've done a lot of Indigenous consultation, and we've worked to include the results of that consultation into this bricks and mortar response so that it is sustainable, meaningful, human responsive service to the community for a long, long time. Where my work in community music at the Working Center and at the library all kind of comes together in the music piece for me is this idea of understanding the other, really opening to another person, in this case, just someone who's not you. When I was doing my master's work for the MA in community music, I was working really esoterically on this ethical idea that I could invite people into a depth of understanding or a deeper understanding, epiphany, or a series of aha moments that would increase their knowing of a space, of a place. And that place was a particular place in the Working Center that was extremely intentional and highly complex, and that people could easily access, but couldn't necessarily understand implicitly in its complexity. And so this sounded community music project that included volunteers making music and mixing soundscape and soundtrack in an effort to create depth of meaning was in service of this ethic of transparency. I was working actively to let go of my privilege, which was to hold special knowledge and information as an employee. And while I was working on my master's, my musical partner and cousin was also working on his master's, but in philosophy. We were kind of mining a similar area. He was doing his work on expanding on an integrated philosophy of the scholar Levinas. He was working on the value of art and specifically in non-representational art. In his study, he was considering an abstracted sculpture that he walked by on his daily commute. What is the value of this to the individual and the community? Why is it meaningful? How can it be useful to all kinds of different people? And I was kind of struggling with this idea too. What is the value of music within the context that I work? And I come from punk rock music, and the value of that music that I was making for the longest time was to disrupt status quo, to create ruptured space, to be a little prodding, to be antagonistic to bureaucracy. And these things are important. But as I began to work in grassroots organizations with radicalized individuals doing very practical work, the value of that music became less because I was not invested in disrupting people who are already highly marginalized, or you might say highly disrupted. And so the merit of these things, the long-term musical practice and the community building work, was fraught. But what my cousin James expanded on was really meaningful and impactful, I think, to my immediate work and to my work going forward in valuing music as part of a social and environmental response to crisis. I continued to work in community organizations under the auspices that possibly non-representational art, and I include music in this definition, may act as a meaningful portal to the other. In Levinas' understanding of the self, he posits that everything that exists within your range exists within your totality. The idea is that everything inside your totality is an object that serves you. So the microphone serves me, the piano in the background, it serves me, the camera, it serves me. There's nothing within this totality that doesn't serve me in my understanding of it. And so my totality is total. My understanding is total, and it is unbreached. The only thing that Levinas concludes can break down that totality is the human face or visage. The idea that a human face could emerge on what's called a shared horizon of meaning, that it would not be part of your totality because you recognize another person as potentially having their own totality that you're not a part of. You understand that they may not serve your totality. And in Levinas's writing, this is the real understanding of self, the self in relation, the self within the breached or disruptive totality, wherein that totality is breached by another person. And of course, Levinas is writing after World War II. He's thinking a lot about the extent of which you'd have to objectify another human in order to subject them to the horrors of Auschwitz. So what my cousin was suggesting was that non-representational art, music, could potentially be a useful portal to the other, where the human face doesn't exist. So when you look at this or you experience non-representational art, what you're doing is you are disrupting your totality in much the same way that a human face might. And that you would learn about yourself in relationship. You would imagine the other, and that you would grow an authentic understanding of yourself in relationship with shared humanity, with impending humanity. And so in that sense, non-representational art and music undergirds a lot of my understanding. And the practice of this music making, or the access to music, the access to tools, the access to community building, where music is a tool for understanding, is really important and affects the way that I work to create public spaces and respond to climate change and continue to imagine responding in real ways. And it's more than just the act of music making or the understanding that non-representational art has value potentially in this way that allows you to understand yourself. But it moves into this concept of reciprocity as we prepare for a future that will include new people, new cultures, people who are displaced, the people we've talked about, people who are being displaced by climate change. We may be able to prepare to tune, to attune, to disarm, to imagine reciprocity through this lens of music by using this proxy to people that we can't meet yet, to prepare ourselves for a socially responsible and ethical future wherein the world is warmed. Thank you so much for listening.